I want you to like close your eyes for a second and just picture this. You are holding your breath.
Okay.
And you are sinking into the dark, just crushing depths of the ocean.
Sounds terrifying, honestly.
Right. But here's the thing. You have no oxygen tank strapped to your back. There's no high-tech dive computer on your wrist or anything like that.
Oh, wow. So just you and the water?
Exactly. All you have is a heavy set of weights pulling you down and like a pair of hand-carved woody goggles keeping the salt water out of your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And the light from the surface is just fading into this deep, murky blue.
Yeah, the pressure at that point must be intense.
It is. The pressure on your chest is building, squeezing your lungs down to basically a fraction of their normal size. Your body's screaming for air, but you just keep dropping. Down, down, down.
I mean, scientifically speaking, it's a physiological nightmare for a terrestrial mammal.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Like, the human body is entirely adapted to walking around in a sea of air, right? Not water. When you introduce water, and specifically the intense hydrostatic pressure of deep water, our physiology is pushed into an absolute state of crisis.
A complete panic mode.
Basically, yeah. Our biology fights back with literally everything it has just to keep the brain alive.
And yet what feels like an absolute crisis to us is it's just a Tuesday morning commute for the people we are focusing on today.
It really is.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are exploring the extreme absolute limits of human breath hold diving. We are using the history and the culture of the Bajau people, who are these legendary sea nomads of Southeast Asia, as our main narrative compass today.
Which is such a fascinating group to look at.
Totally. But we are going far beyond just the cultural anthropology here. We are looking at comprehensive physiological reviews and this massive, groundbreaking genetic study published in the journal Cell.
Right, the 2018 Cell paper.
Yeah, that one. And we're going to figure out how thousands of years at sea haven't just shaped a culture, but have literally rewritten human DNA.
And the Bajau just offer this completely unprecedented lens for this. Through them, and, by comparing their traditions with other ancient diving cultures, we can actually examine the physical limits of the human body.
We're way further than I ever thought.
Oh, absolutely. We are going to look at the immediate, really violent physiological reflexes that happen the second your face hits the water. And then...
Like flipping a switch.
Literally. And then we'll cross the threshold into evolutionary biology.
Right.
We are looking at genetic adaptations that give an entire population a permanent biological advantage in the deep.
Okay, I want to establish some historical footing first because, humanity's relationship with the deep ocean didn't just start with modern scuba gear.
Right. It goes way, way back.
People have been doing this for millennia, long before anyone understood the concept of gas partial pressures or oxygen molecules. We're talking ancient history here.
Yeah, and the archaeological evidence pushes this timeline incredibly far back. Excavations of coastal settlements from 40,000 years ago reveal evidence of early human civilizations actively harvesting seafood.
40,000 years. That's wild.
It is. And the crucial detail in those middens, which are essentially ancient refuse heaps, is the presence of specific types of deep-water shellfish and sponges.
So not just stuff washed up on the beach.
Exactly. These weren't things you could just pick up while wading in the tide pool. Someone actually had to swim down and get them.
The idea of diving headfirst into the abyss is so ancient, it was actually used as a casual metaphor in classical literature.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's this line in Homer's Iliad, which dates back to roughly 1200 BC. Homer is describing a charioteer being violently knocked from his chariot during battle.
Okay.
And he describes the man falling, quote, like an oyster diver.
Huh.
Right? So for that metaphor to even land with a general audience in 1200 BC, the concept of a diver plunging off a boat to grab oysters had to be universally understood.
That makes total sense. It really speaks to how normalized the profession was across the Mediterranean and beyond. And honestly, the historical accounts of what these early divers achieved are just staggering.
Especially considering they had zero modern equipment. Nothing.
Right. Consider this account from 1913. It involves a Greek sponge diver named Giorgio Stati. So the Italian Navy had lost an anchor from one of their ships, the Regina Margherita, in the Aegean Sea.
Okay, a huge naval anchor.
Massive. And they couldn't retrieve it. Stati, who was this local sponge diver, and reportedly physically unimposing, by the way, and suffered from emphysema, offered to help.
Wait, he had emphysema? A lung condition?
Yeah, and he tied himself to a heavy rock, took a single breath, and descended to 70 meters.
70 meters. I tried to visualize that earlier. If you look over the edge of a 20-story building, You were looking at roughly 70 meters.
It's a massive drop.
And Stoddy swam that distance straight down, tied a rope to the anchor, and came back up, all on one single lungful of air.
It's almost unbelievable.
How does a human body from 1913, without any fins or buoyancy compensators, even survive the sheer physics of that descent?
Well, he used a highly specialized technique. It relies entirely on gravity and this massive rock called a campanile.
So the rock just drags you down fast.
Exactly. But while Stoddy's dive is this phenomenal singular feat of human endurance, if we really want to understand the sustained cultural practice of breath hold diving, we need to turn our attention to the ama.
Yes, the ama divers of Japan. I was completely captivated by their history when looking through the sources.
They have an incredible story.
The word ama literally translates to sea woman, and they have this rich, unbroken lineage spanning over 2,000 years.
2 millennia of continuous diving.
Yeah, there are written records referencing them as far back as 238 BC. These are communities operating in the freezing coastal waters of Japan, gathering abalone, turbo snails, sea urchins, and the specific types of seaweed used to make agar.
And for the vast majority of that 2,000-year history, this was an exclusively female profession.
Which is so interesting. Why was that?
The dynamics behind it are fascinating. Culturally, the men in these coastal villages were often away for really long periods, working as sailors or fishermen in much deeper waters.
So the women were running the local coastal economy.
Exactly. They were left to manage the local coastal resources. But there is also a very compelling physiological argument for why women dominated this specific type of cold water diving.
Oh, right, the thermal insulation aspect.
Yep.
I read that women generally possess a slightly thicker layer of subcutaneous fat compared to men.
That's right.
So in waters that are hovering around freezing, that extra layer of natural insulation was just a massive biological advantage.
It was everything. It allowed them to stay submerged longer without immediately succumbing to hypothermia. And that thermal advantage pretty much dictated their working conditions for centuries.
Because they didn't have wetsuits back then.
Not at all. Until relatively recently, the Alma dub almost entirely naked, wearing only a simple loincloth.
In freezing water.
Yeah. It wasn't until the 1940s that they transitioned to wearing these white cotton dresses.
Which, let's be honest, cotton in cold water does absolutely nothing to keep you warm.
Right. It provided virtually no thermal protection. It was primarily to protect their skin from the sharp rocks and abrasive shells on the seafloor. And, some lore suggests the white color was meant to deter sharks.
Oh, wow. But the real technological leap for the ama wasn't the clothing at all, right? It was the goggles.
Yes. The goggles changed everything.
About 150 years ago, they started using these hand-carved wooden goggles. But they had this one specific feature that is just brilliant. They fitted these goggles with small, soft leather or rubber bulbs on the sides.
And the physics behind those bulbs is just a masterclass in practical engineering.
How so?
Well, when you descend in water, the pressure increases exponentially. That pressure pushes inward on the air trapped inside your goggles.
Okay, because of the depth.
Right. According to Boyle's law, as pressure increases, the volume of a gas must decrease.
Which means the air inside the goggles actually shrinks.
Exactly. It shrinks and creates an intense vacuum right over your eyes. If you go deep enough without equalizing that space, the vacuum can become so strong it can actually rupture the blood vessels in your eyes.
Oh, God.
Or, in really extreme cases, begin to pull the eyeball itself out of the socket.
Stop. That is horrifying.
It is. It's a terrifying concept called a mask squeeze.
Terrifying and obviously highly destructive to your vision. I mean, modern scuba divers prevent this by simply exhaling a tiny bit of air from their nose into their silicone mask, right?
Yeah.
To equalize the pressure.
Yep, it's super simple today.
But the AMA were using rigid wooden goggles that didn't cover the nose. They couldn't exhale into them.
Right, and that is exactly where the rubber bulbs came in. The bulbs held a small reserve of extra air. As the AMA descended and the water pressure squeezed those flexible bulbs, the trapped air was forced into the rigid wooden space over the eyes. It automatically equalized the internal pressure, completely preventing the vacuum effect.
It is such an elegant, low-tech solution to a massive physical problem, and that ingenuity allowed them to dive deeper and more safely. But the ultimate game changer for the AMA arrived in the 1960s, right? With the modern wetsuit.
Oh, the introduction of the neoprene wetsuit completely revolutionized the practice. It totally removed the thermal bottleneck that had governed their profession for 2 millennia.
Because they weren't freezing to death anymore.
Exactly. Suddenly, the limiting factor wasn't how fast they were losing body heat to the ocean. The limiting factor was solely their muscular endurance and oxygen capacity.
So they could stay in much, much longer.
Right. Once they had wetsuits, their productivity just exploded. They went from doing maybe a dozen dives a day to performing up to 100 dives in a single shift.
100 breath hold dives a day is staggering. I can't even imagine the fatigue. And to manage that kind of volume, they developed this highly structured, almost industrial system.
They had to, yeah.
Like, there were two distinct classifications of AMA divers. First, you had the Cachito. These were essentially unassisted divers operating in the shallower waters.
Right. A Cachito diver would swim from the shore or a small boat and descend to maybe 5 or 7 meters using her own muscular power. She'd forage on the bottom and then swim back to the surface.
And she'd use like a small wooden tub floating on the surface to hold her catch.
Exactly. She'd rest there between dives. But because she was actively swimming against her own buoyancy on the way down, it was incredibly energy intensive.
She was burning a lot of fuel.
Tons of it. Her muscles were burning through oxygen rapidly, meaning her bottom time was very short, often less than a minute.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had the Funado, the heavy-duty boat-assisted divers.
The Fornado operation was intense. It required a partner, usually the diver's husband, who stayed in the boat.
So she's not swimming down on her own.
Nope. A Fornado diver didn't waste any energy swimming down. She would hold on to a heavy weight attached to a rope, and that weight would just drag her plummeting to the seafloor.
Sometimes reaching depths of 20 meters, right?
Easily 20 meters. And the conservation of energy there is the key. By essentially falling to the bottom, the Fornado diver kept her heart rate much lower and her muscle oxygen consumption to an absolute minimum.
Which means she arrived at the bottom with a much larger reserve of oxygen in her blood.
Exactly, allowing her to stay submerged and work for a significantly longer period. When she felt the urge to breathe, she would tug on a separate lifeline.
And the husband on the boat pulls her up.
Yep, her partner on the surface would use a pulley system to haul her up as fast as possible.
It is total trust. I mean, you are 20 meters deep, completely out of air, relying entirely on the person above you to pull you into the light.
It's a remarkable partnership.
And before they drop, the AMA do this very specific breathing technique, right? The isobee or the sea whistle.
Yes, the sea whistle, it's iconic.
They hyperventilate slightly and then let out this high-pitched, almost haunting whistle through pursed lips. It regulates their breathing, calms their nervous system, and just prepares their lungs for the pressure.
The isobee serves both a physiological and a psychological purpose. It forces a slow, controlled exhalation, which actually helps manage the buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood.
Oh, interesting.
But notice a common thread in all of this, right? The Aima are extraordinary, but they are still visitors to the ocean.
That's a great point. They live on land.
Right. They are terrestrial humans who have developed incredible behavioral and technological strategies to survive brief excursions into the deep. They spend perhaps 2 to 5 hours a day in the water, which is a massive chunk of time, but then they return to their houses on solid ground.
And they are meticulous about their safety margins. They know exactly where their limits are, and they are very careful never to push themselves into the danger zone of a hypoxic blackout.
They have to be.
They are basically aquatic commuters, which creates the perfect contrast for the other group we are looking at. If the Aima are commuters, the Bajau are permanent residents.
That is the perfect way to put it. The Bajau of Southeast Asia represent a completely different paradigm of human interaction with the ocean.
The sea nomads.
Yeah, they are widely known as the sea nomads. For over 1,000 years, they haven't just worked in the ocean, they have lived upon it.
Their whole life is out there.
Everything. Their homes, their communities, their economy, their diet. It is all built around living on houseboats or stilt structures floating on the coastal seas around Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines.
And because the ocean is their entire world, their diving statistics are, honestly, almost incomprehensible.
They really push the limits of human biology.
Like, Bajau divers routinely hit depths of over 70 meters. That is Stati's legendary anchor dive from 1913. But they're doing it every single day, repeatedly.
And using rudimentary weights and those same style of hand-carved wooden goggles.
But the statistic that truly stopped me in my tracks when reading the source material was their time spent submerged.
It's wild, isn't it?
A Bajau diver can spend up to 60% of their daily working time completely underwater.
Let's just think about the implications of that number for a second. Over half of their working life is spent in a state of voluntary asphyxiation.
Just holding their breath.
Holding their breath and operating under crushing hydrostatic pressure.
I just need to wrap my head around that. How does the human biological machine survive spending 60% of its day starved of oxygen and crushed by water? Like if I hold my breath for a minute sitting on my couch, I feel like I'm going to pass out.
Same.
What is literally happening to their organs when they drop 70 meters down?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the sheer physics of immersion. We have to look at what physically happens to any mammal, you, me, a harbor seal, or a Bajau diver, the very moment we're submerged.
The violence of hydrostatic pressure.
Exactly. We have to understand how heavy water really is.
Right, because we are so used to walking through air that we forget it has a density. The research points out that water is 784 times denser than air at sea level.
784 times. That density is the driving force of everything that happens next.
Okay, break that down for me.
When you stand in air, the atmospheric pressure pushing on your head is virtually identical to the pressure pushing on your feet. It's equalized.
Right.
But water is so dense that it creates a steep vertical pressure gradient. For every 10 meters you descend, the pressure increases by 1 full atmosphere.
Wow.
But even just floating upright at the surface, the water pressure pushing against your calves is significantly higher than the pressure pushing against your chest.
So you are physically being squeezed from the bottom up. It's like rolling up a tube of toothpaste from the crimped end.
That visual perfectly captures the mechanical reality. The human body is essentially a flexible container filled with fluids.
Right.
When that external water pressure squeezes your legs and your abdomen, it physically forces blood and interstitial fluids out of your lower extremities.
Now, where does it go?
Those fluids follow the path of least resistance, flowing upwards directly into your chest cavity and your heart.
The physiological term I saw for this was lung centroid pressure. It sounds highly technical, but it basically means your chest suddenly gets flooded with a massive volume of fluid from your own legs.
Precisely. The veins in your chest engorge, and your heart physically expands to accommodate the sudden influx of blood.
That sounds dangerous. Actually, this internal fluid shift serves a really vital protective purpose.
Oh, really?
As you dive deeper and the water pressure tries to literally crush your lungs, having those pulmonary blood vessels engorged with fluid prevents the chest cavity from collapsing entirely.
Oh, because you can't compress liquid.
Exactly. Fluids are largely incompressible, so filling the chest with blood acts as an internal structural reinforcement against the crushing depth.
That is wild. The water tries to crush your chest, so your body uses the pressure on your legs to pump a hydraulic shield of blood into your lungs.
It's an incredible mechanical adaptation. It really is.
Yeah.
But that is just the mechanical plumbing
Right.
of dealing with pressure, right?
Right.
That doesn't explain the oxygen problem. How do you survive the fact that you aren't breathing?
For that, we enter the realm of neurology and the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
We have to look at what the renowned physiologist Perscolander termed the master switch of life.
The master switch.
Yes. This is the mammalian diving response. It is an ancient, involuntary survival reflex that is completely hardwired into our biology.
And it triggers automatically.
Yes, but it's triggered by 2 very specific stimuli occurring at the exact same time. First, apnea, which is the cessation of breathing, and second, the immersion of the face in cold water.
The face specifically, not like the arm or the leg.
Nope, it has to be the face. Your face is packed with thermal receptors connected directly to the trigeminal nerve.
Okay.
When those receptors register the sudden drop in temperature from cold water, and simultaneously your brain registers that your lungs have stopped expanding, it sends a massive alarm signal straight to the brainstem.
Like a red alert.
Exactly. The brainstem realizes the organism is entering a state of asphyxia.
Let's do a quick experiment for anyone listening. If you are not driving, take a breath, hold it, and keep listening. We're going to hold it for just a little bit.
Perfect.
As you sit there holding your breath, your body is actually entering that state of asphyxia. And asphyxia isn't just one thing, right? The medical literature defines it as a triad of terrors. 3 distinct, simultaneous crises.
Yes, the triad. The first part of the triad is cellular hypoxia. Your cells are actively consuming the oxygen in your blood, and because you aren't breathing, that oxygen isn't being replenished. The tank is running dry.
Okay, so if you are still holding your breath with us, you might be feeling a slight burning sensation in your chest right now, like a growing panic, an urge to gasp. That feeling is actually the second part of the triad, right? Hypercapnia?
Exactly. It isn't the lack of oxygen making your chest burn. It is the toxic buildup of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream. Your cells are producing exhaust, and you can't exhale it.
Okay, you can breathe normally now. But yeah, that burning...
That burning sensation is the primary trigger that tells the human body to breathe.
What?
And if the hypercapnia continues, it leads to the third part of the triad, acidosis.
Acidosis? That sounds bad.
It is. The excess carbon dioxide actually dissolves into your blood plasma and forms carbonic acid. Your blood literally becomes more acidic.
Wow.
Which begins to severely disrupt basic cellular functions.
So hypoxia, hypercapnia, acidosis. A completely lethal combination.
Absolutely.
So the trigeminal nerve senses the water, the brainstem senses the asphyxia, and it flips the master switch to fight back. What is the very first line of defense?
The very first physiological reaction is diving bradycardia.
Which is what?
It's an abrupt, severe slowing of the heart rate. It is an immediate override of the cardiac system.
How slow are we talking?
Well, researchers in the 1960s managed to hook primitive ECG monitors to AMA and Pearl divers, and they were astounded. They recorded the divers' heart rates plummeting to between 30 and 40 beats per minute
While they were swimming.
while they were actively foraging on the seafloor.
30 beats a minute. A normal, relaxed, resting heart rate is maybe 60 to 80 beats a minute.
Right.
These divers are dropping their heart rates to half of their resting rate while they're doing intense physical labor underwater.
Which breaks all the normal rules of exercise physiology.
Yeah, if you go for a run, your heart rate skyrockets to pump more oxygenated blood to your straining leg muscles.
Exactly. But in a deep dive, the body realizes that running out of oxygen is a far greater threat than muscle fatigue. It forces a radical compromise.
So the body just puts the brakes on.
The vagus nerve essentially clamps down on the heart, forcing it to beat at a crawl purely to conserve the finite amount of oxygen left in the circulatory system.
Well, wait, if the heart is beating that slowly, how do the swimming muscles get any oxygen to actually move?
Well, they don't. Or rather, they get severely restricted access. This brings us to the second major component of the diving response.
Okay.
Intense peripheral vasoconstriction.
Okay, let's visualize this. It's like a submarine taking heavy damage and going into emergency power mode.
That's a good analogy.
The captain knows the battery is dying. So they intentionally cut the power to the crew quarters, the heating systems, and the galley. They plunge half the sub into darkness just to ensure that the core command center and the navigation computers have enough juice to survive the crisis.
The human body does exactly the same thing. The sympathetic nervous system triggers the smooth muscles lining the blood vessels in your arms, your legs, and even your non-essential organs like your kidneys and stomach to violently contract.
Just shuts them down.
It squeezes those vessels shut. It completely shunts the remaining oxygen-rich blood away from your extremities, pooling it entirely in the core of your body.
To protect the important stuff.
Right, to maintain a continuous supply to the heart muscle and the brain.
It abandons the limbs to save the mind. That is brutal, but incredibly efficient. Now, I have to ask, is this extreme submarine lockdown only happening in these elite trained divers, or is this happening inside me? Like, if I go fill a mixing bowl with ice water right now and plunge my face into it, will my heart rate crash and my arms lose blood flow?
You absolutely possess this reflex.
Great.
Yes, it is a latent evolutionary echo embedded in the DNA of all mammals. If you submerged your face in ice water right now, you would likely see a 10 to 20% reduction in your heart rate within seconds.
No way.
And you would experience mild peripheral vasoconstriction. But the key difference lies in the magnitude and the efficiency of the response.
So my master switch is just a bit rusty compared to theirs.
Exactly. In trained apneists, or in populations like the AMA and the Bajau, who have been triggering this reflex daily for generations, the response is profoundly amplified.
They've optimized it.
Right. Their nervous systems have become highly tuned, they can drop their heart rates much further, and constrict their peripheral vessels more aggressively and rapidly.
Wow.
They perfectly thread the needle between allowing just enough blood to the limbs to physically swim and hoarding enough in the core to keep the brain conscious.
Slowing the heart and locking down the blood vessels makes total logical sense.
Yeah.
You are aggressively hoarding the oxygen you already have.
Right.
But here is where the research took a massive turn for me. Hoarding is one thing. But what if your body could literally manufacture a fresh supply of oxygen while you were 50 meters underwater?
Yeah, this brings us to the third, and for a long time, the most overlooked component of the human diving response.
Splenic contraction. We need to talk about the spleen.
We do.
I feel like the spleen is the most ignored organ in the human body.
It really gets a bad rap.
People only really know about it if they rupture it in a car crash or have to get it removed because of severe mononucleosis. My high school biology understanding was that the spleen was just like a passive filter for the immune system, kind of a graveyard for old, worn-out red blood cells.
It definitely serves that filtering function, but its internal architecture allows it to do something far more dynamic.
Okay, what does it do?
The spleen is composed of tissue called red pulp, which is incredibly vascular. It acts like a massive spongy reservoir.
Reservoir for what?
It absorbs and stores a highly concentrated volume of fully oxygenated red blood cells.
Okay, so you have this sponge full of oxygen-rich blood sitting in your abdomen. How does that help a diver?
When a diver descends and the brainstem registers severe asphyxia, it activates a very specific pathway in the sympathetic nervous system. It floods the system with catecholamines.
Which are what exactly?
Essentially, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Those stress hormones act like a chemical key.
Right.
They bind to specific receptors on the spleen called alpha-2 adrenoreceptors. When those receptors are unlocked by the adrenaline, it causes the smooth muscle capsule surrounding the spleen to violently contract.
It literally wings the sponge out.
Yes, it forcefully wrings the sponge out directly into the circulatory system, and the volume we are talking about is significant.
How much blood are we talking?
Data from physiological studies shows that a single contraction of the human spleen during a deep breath hold dive can expel approximately 160 milliliters of densely packed red blood cells.
160 milliliters. That is like a little more than half a can of soda. But it's pure oxygen-carrying red blood cells. What does injecting that specific volume do to the body's overall oxygen levels?
It causes an immediate spike in your hematocrit, which is the ratio of red blood cells to total blood volume.
Okay.
Expelling that much concentrated blood translates to a massive, instantaneous increase in the total oxygen-carrying capacity of your circulatory system, ranging anywhere from a 2.8% to a 9.6% boost.
A near 10% boost in oxygen deployed precisely at the moment you're running out of air.
It's incredible.
It is literally an internal scuba tank. That is unbelievable engineering. And scientists didn't discover this by looking at tissue samples in a lab. They discovered it by dragging ultrasound machines onto the boats of the AMA.
They did. The pivotal field research occurred in 1990. A researcher named Herford conducted a study specifically on the Korean AMA divers.
Okay.
He used portable ultrasonography to monitor the physical size of their spleens before, during, and after their diving shifts.
Wow, right out on the water.
And he documented clear physical evidence of the spleen rapidly shrinking, contracting during the dives to inject that oxygen, and then slowly re-expanding to store more blood when they rested on the surface.
And it isn't just a human trick either. This exact same mechanism is found throughout marine mammals.
Oh, absolutely.
If you look at different species of seals, there is a direct linear correlation between the size of a seal's spleen and its maximum dive time. Like Weddell seals, which can stay underwater for over an hour, have proportionally massive spleens compared to seals that only do shallow, quick dives.
The larger the spleen, the larger the internal reservoir of red blood cells.
That makes sense.
The larger the reservoir, the more oxygen you can dump into the system during a dive, extending your time before hypoxia sets in. The biological math is very straightforward.
Which leads to the most provocative question of all. If seals evolved bigger spleens to dive longer, and human spleens act as an internal oxygen tank, could a human population actually evolve to have a larger spleen just by spending 1,000 years living on the ocean?
Right. Could the Bajau have fundamentally genetically altered their anatomy?
Exactly.
That exact hypothesis is what drove an international team of researchers to conduct the groundbreaking 2018 study published in Cell. This is where our exploration shifts from temporary physiology, the immediate reflexes of a single dive, to permanent, hardwired evolutionary genetics.
And the setup for this study is just fascinating. It took place in Indonesia, on the central Sulawesi Peninsula.
Yeah, the lead researcher, Melissa Ilardo, wanted to set up a natural experiment.
Right, and she found the perfect conditions by comparing two distinct but geographically close populations. First, she focused on the Bajau people living in a seaside village called Jayabakti.
These are the sea nomads, the people diving daily to 70 meters.
Exactly. And then, as the control group, the researchers looked at the Siluan people.
Right, the Siluan.
The Siluan live in a village called Koyuan, which is located only about 25 kilometers inland from Jayabakti. Genetically and geographically, they are close neighbors.
But culturally and environmentally, they are worlds apart.
Right, the Siluans are primarily an agricultural society. They farm the land, they interact very minimally with the marine environment.
It is an evolutionary biologist's dream scenario.
Yeah.
You have two populations sharing the same regional climate and broad ancestry, but subjected to radically different environmental survival pressures.
One group must hold their breath to eat. The other group just needs a plow.
Basically. So the research team hauls a portable ultrasound machine and a bunch of DNA saliva swabs into these remote villages.
Which is an undertaking in itself.
Definitely. Their methodology was meticulous, though. They successfully convinced 59 Bajau individuals and 34 Siluan individuals to participate.
Okay, good sample size.
Yeah, and they used the ultrasound to take precise volumetric measurements of everyone's spleens and collected the saliva for full genomic sequencing.
And there's a crucial detail in how they handled that data. They didn't just measure 59 random people and average the number.
No, they couldn't do that.
They ran kinship analyses on the DNA to map out the family trees within the villages. If they found that two participants were closely related, say a mother and a daughter or two brothers, they entirely removed one of those individuals from the final data set.
That process is called filtering for relatedness, and it is absolutely vital in population genetics.
Why is it so important?
Because if you don't do that, and you happen to measure a single family that just genetically happens to have unusually large spleens.
It skews the data.
Exactly. Your data will falsely suggest the entire village has large spleens. By strictly filtering out close relatives, they ensured that any anatomical trends they found were genuinely representative of the broader population's genetic makeup, not just a familial quirk.
So they clean the data, they compare the ultrasound measurements between the oceanic Bajau and the agricultural Siluan, and the results are undeniable. The Bajau population possessed significantly larger spleens than the Siluan.
And we aren't just talking about a tiny margin of error here. We are talking about a statistically massive structural difference in organ volume.
But wait, the mere fact that the spleens were larger wasn't the groundbreaking part, right? Because you could easily argue that a larger spleen is simply a plastic biological response to the extreme physical stress of diving.
A plastic response, exactly. Like going to the gym and lifting heavy weights.
Right. Your bicep gets physically larger in response to the environmental stress of lifting. But you don't pass that massive bicep onto your children. If you stop lifting, the muscle shrinks back down. It's a temporary adaptation by the individual body.
Exactly. If the enlarged spleen was simply a plastic response, like a muscle getting stronger from being repeatedly wrung out by adrenaline every day, then only the Bajau individuals who actively engaged in deep diving would show the enlargement.
And this is the pivot point of the entire study, the moment that changes our whole understanding of human biology.
It really is.
The researchers deliberately took ultrasound measurements of Bajau individuals who did not dive.
Right. Maybe they were elders who had never dove. Maybe they were individuals who worked entirely above water on the houseboats.
They had never subjected their bodies to the crushing pressure or the profound asphyxia of the deep ocean.
And the ultrasound revealed that even those non-diving Bajau individuals possessed spleens that were significantly larger than those of the Siluan people.
Wow.
The enlarged organ was present regardless of their individual behavior.
Which completely destroys the plastic response theory. Like, if you have a massive bicep but you've never lifted a weight in your life, you didn't build that bicep in the gym. You were born with it.
Exactly. It proved definitively that the enlarged spleen is a highly heritable, hardwired genetic adaptation. The Bajau are literally gestating and birthing children equipped with larger internal scuba tanks.
That is just mind-blowing. The physical demands of their culture have fundamentally, permanently altered their anatomical blueprint.
It's evolution in action.
But knowing the spleen is structurally larger is one thing, a phenomenal anatomical discovery. But biology is driven by code. Finding the exact lines of code in the human genome that command the body to build a larger spleen, that is needle in a haystack territory.
Yeah.
How did the researchers isolate the specific genetic mutations responsible for this?
They utilized the saliva swabs to perform a comprehensive genomic scan for selection signatures.
How does that work?
Well, they sequenced the DNA of the Bajau and compared it against the Siluan, and also against broader global genetic databases like the Han Chinese population.
Okay, looking for differences.
Right. They were actively hunting for specific regions of the genome where the Bajau showed a radically different allele frequency areas where a specific genetic variant was highly common in the Bajau but extremely rare everywhere else.
And that spike points them to the gene.
Yes. That kind of localized genetic spike is a strong statistical indicator that natural selection has aggressively favored that specific gene in that specific environment.
So they're looking for the genetic fingerprint of evolution in real time.
Precisely. And when the computers finished crunching the billions of base pairs, their top hit, the strongest signal of evolutionary selection in the entire Bajau genome, pointed to a variant in a gene called PDE10A.
PD10A. It is a fascinating gene because its primary function isn't actually in the spleen at all.
Right, which surprises people. When you look at genetics, it is rarely a one-to-one correlation where gene A directly builds organ B. Biology operates on these really complex cascading pathways.
So what does PD10A actually do?
PD10A regulates the cyclic AMP pathway in the thyroid gland.
The thyroid. Oh.
Specifically, the variant found in the Bajau acts to limit the release of something called thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. By limiting TSH, it subtly alters the baseline levels of active thyroid hormones, specifically T4 and T3 circulating in the bloodstream.
Okay, I'm trying to connect dots here. How does tweaking the thyroid hormone levels in the neck result in a massive blood storage organ in the abdomen?
Good question. We know from extensive physiological studies, primarily in murine models, which are mice, that thyroid hormones play a critical role in organogenesis, which is the developmental growth of organs.
Okay.
Specifically, higher or altered levels of certain thyroid hormones directly stimulate the proliferation of splenic tissue.
Oh, wow.
So, by possessing a genetic variant that subtly alters their thyroid output, the Bajau trigger a systemic hormonal cascade during their physical development that ultimately results in the construction of a structurally massive spleen.
That's incredible. It's like tweaking the main thermostat in the hallway to trick the boiler in the basement into expanding the plumbing system.
That's a great way to think about it.
It is an entirely indirect, highly elegant biological hack. But the genetic discoveries didn't stop at the spleen. PD10A was the top hit, but there was a second major selection signature found in the Bajau genome, right?
Yes, and this second gene variant brings us full circle back to the intense physiological reflexes we discussed earlier.
Oh, the master switch.
Exactly. The second strongest signal was found on a gene called BDKRB2.
BDKRB2. I highlighted this in the research because it holds a very unique distinction in the scientific literature. Prior to this Bajau study, BDKRB2 was the only gene that scientists had ever suggested might play a role in regulating the human diving reflex.
And its specific function aligns perfectly with the physics of diving. BDKRB2 encodes for a receptor that interacts with bradykinin.
And what does bradykinin do?
It's a peptide that is deeply involved in regulating the dilation and constriction of vascular smooth muscle. It controls the diameter of your blood vessels.
Oh, this is the submarine lockdown mechanism, the peripheral vasoconstriction.
Exactly. The fact that researchers found a massive selection signature specifically on the BDKRB2 gene in the Bajau population is essentially a biological smoking gun.
It all connects.
It strongly implies that the Bajau haven't just evolved a larger internal oxygen tank via their spleens, they have simultaneously evolved a genetically superior master switch.
They're better at shutting off the limbs.
Yes. They have hardwired their autonomic nervous system to execute that peripheral lockdown, shunting the blood away from their limbs and into their core with far greater speed and efficiency than the average human.
So they have a bigger gas tank, and they have evolved a more efficient fuel injection system to manage it. The dual adaptation is just mind-blowing.
It's amazing.
And the study touches on one more gene variant that completes the survival picture, FAM178B.
Right. FAM178B is the final piece of the puzzle regarding the triad of asphyxia.
A hypoxia, hypercapnia, and acidosis.
Exactly. This gene encodes a protein that forms a complex involved in maintaining the balance of carbon dioxide and bicarbonate in the blood. Essentially, it helps regulate the activity of carbonic anhydrase.
Let's translate that back to the breath-holding experiment we did earlier. When we held our breath, our chest started to burn because the carbon dioxide was building up, creating hypercapnia and pushing our blood toward acidosis.
Precisely. Hypercapnia is usually the limiting factor that forces a diver to surface and breathe long before they actually run out of oxygen.
So how does FAM178B help?
A genetic adaptation in FAM178B that enhances the blood's ability to buffer that carbon dioxide, to chemically neutralize the acidity, would radically delay the onset of that burning panic.
Wow.
It would allow a Bajau diver to remain calm and functional at depth for significantly longer.
Bigger tank, better fuel efficiency, superior exhaust management. The Bajau are literally genetically engineered for the deep.
They really are.
But, this raises a fundamental philosophical question about how evolution actually operates. When we look at PD10A, BDKRB2 and FAM178B, did the Bajau suddenly mutate these highly specific, perfectly advantageous genes just because they started diving off houseboats 1,000 years ago? Does the sheer act of struggling for breath cause the DNA to mutate in response?
I'm glad you brought that up because that is a very common misconception about evolution, the idea that need directly drives mutation.
Right, like Lamarckian evolution.
Exactly. In reality, evolutionary biologists explain this phenomenon through a concept called standing variation.
Let's break down standing variation. What does that actually mean for the human gene pool?
It means that these specific genetic variants, the code for the altered thyroid, the highly responsive blood vessels, the efficient carbon dioxide buffering, they likely already existed within the broader ancient human population.
Well, they were already there.
Yes, they were simply rare variations floating around in the gene pool at very low frequencies. For an ancient human farming wheat or hunting deer on dry land, having a massive spleen or an aggressive diving reflex offered absolutely no survival advantage. It was just neutral, dormant code.
Consider an analogy. Imagine 1,000 people living in Miami, and randomly, 3 of those people happen to have a set of heavy-duty snow tires sitting in their garage.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The tires are there, but in the heat of Florida, they provide absolutely no advantage. They are just standing variation.
Right.
But then, the environment radically changes. Imagine a sudden, permanent ice age hits Miami. Suddenly, those 3 people with the snow tires are the only ones who can successfully drive to the store to get food. They are the only ones who can thrive. Their previously useless trait is now the absolute key to survival.
That is a perfect analogy, and that is exactly what happened to the Bajau. A millennium ago, their ancestors migrated away from the land and began living entirely on the ocean.
The ice age hit, so to speak.
Exactly. Their daily survival, their ability to harvest food, to feed their offspring, to escape storms, it all suddenly depended on their ability to hold their breath and dive into the deep.
And in that extreme, unforgiving aquatic environment, those rare genetic traits became the snow tires.
Yes. The individuals who just happened to carry the PDE10A or BDKRB2 variants from the standing variation could dive just a few meters deeper. They could stay down just a few seconds longer.
Which means they brought up more fish.
Right. They were healthier, they survived longer, and therefore they were statistically much more likely to reproduce and pass those exact genetic advantages onto their children.
And over 1,000 years, generation after generation, the brutal sieve of natural selection aggressively favored those traits, amplifying them until they transformed from rare anomalies into the defining biological characteristics of the entire Bajau population.
It is a stunning, real-world demonstration of human culture actively driving human evolution.
It proves that our biology is not a static endpoint. We are still actively being shaped by the environments we choose to inhabit.
Absolutely.
It's a beautiful narrative of human adaptability. But as we reach the final implications of this deep dive, the source material makes a very sharp pivot. The Bajau's incredible biology isn't just a marvel of anthropology to be admired from afar. It represents an entirely untapped goldmine for modern clinical medicine.
Yes, this is where it gets incredibly relevant to everyone.
We are looking at a medical horizon that could change how we treat emergencies in hospitals worldwide.
And to fully appreciate the medical significance of the Bajau, we have to look at the history of hypoxia research. Hypoxia, again, is the deprivation of adequate oxygen supply at the tissue level.
Right.
For decades, whenever medical researchers wanted to study how human genetics adapt to hypoxia, they directed all their funding and attention to high-altitude populations.
Like the Sherpas.
Exactly. They studied the Sherpas and Tibetans living in the Himalayas, or the Quechua and Andean people living in the high mountains of South America.
Right. Populations living at extreme elevations where the atmospheric pressure is low and the air is incredibly thin. But there is a fundamental clinical difference between living on top of a mountain and diving to the bottom of the ocean.
A huge difference.
High-altitude living induces a state of chronic hypoxia. You are breathing oxygen-depleted air 24 hours a day, year after year. Your body makes slow, long-term adaptations to a persistent, mild lack of oxygen, like producing more red blood cells over time.
Right. Chronic hypoxia is biologically stressful, but it is steady. Breath hold diving, however, induces a state of acute hypoxia.
Acute.
Sudden.
It is sudden, violent, and severe. A diver goes from a state of complete oxygen saturation at the surface to a state of profound, life-threatening oxygen starvation in a matter of minutes, and then rapidly returns to saturation when they surface. It is an aggressive biological shock.
And from a medical perspective, acute hypoxia is arguably the most critical issue in modern emergency medicine.
Without question, when you look at the leading causes of mortality and critical injury in hospitals, you're largely looking at acute hypoxic events.
Like what?
Well, what is an ischemic stroke? A blood clot forms in an artery supplying the brain, abruptly blocking the flow of blood. In an instant, a localized region of brain tissue is violently starved of oxygen.
So a stroke is essentially a localized acute hypoxic event.
Exactly, that is acute hypoxia.
A myocardial infarction, a heart attack, is the exact same mechanism. A blockage in a coronary artery plunges the heart muscle into acute hypoxia. The tissue begins to die in minutes. Right. And even in highly controlled settings, like a major organ transplant, when a surgeon removes a kidney from a donor, they have to sever it from the blood supply. As they transport it to the recipient, that organ is sitting in a cooler, experiencing profound acute hypoxia.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. Time is tissue.
Time is absolutely tissue. And for centuries, modern medicine has struggled to find pharmacological ways to protect human tissue during these acute hypoxic crises. We try to dissolve the clots, we try to cool the bodies, but the cellular damage happens incredibly fast.
And this is why the Bajau genome is invaluable.
This is exactly why. The Bajau have been surviving daily, repeated, severe bouts of acute hypoxia for 1,000 years. Their biology has already solved the problem that our intensive care units are struggling with.
Their cells literally know how to tolerate rapid oxygen loss without dying.
Right. If researchers can decode the precise cellular pathways controlled by genes like PDTAA and BDKRB2, if they can figure out exactly how a Bajau diver's brain withstands the asphyxia of a 70-meter dive, we could potentially develop revolutionary therapeutics.
So we might be able to synthesize drugs that artificially trigger that same protective master switch in a stroke patient during the critical first hour of an attack, preserving their brain tissue until surgeons can clear the clot.
We are looking at a paradigm shift. We have spent decades looking up at the mountains for answers to oxygen deprivation. These sea nomads have proven that we should have been looking down into the oceans. They offer an entirely new, deeply relevant system of human physiological adaptation to explore.
We have covered an immense landscape today.
We really have.
We started with the sheer terror of sinking into the dark ocean, feeling the water crush against our chests. We traced humanity's ancient relationship with the deep, from Homer's metaphors to the extraordinary Ama women plunging into the freezing Japanese coastal waters with simple rubber-bowled goggles, mastering their thermal limits.
And we unpacked the violent physics of immersion, learning how the crushing pressure forces blood into our lungs and how our brainstem violently throws the master switch of life to slow our hearts and lock down our limbs.
And we followed that thread of physiological survival all the way down to the DNA of the Bajau sea nomads. We explored how 1,000 years of an aquatic lifestyle didn't just teach them incredible breath-holding techniques, it actively reorganized their genome.
It gave them physically enlarged spleens, hyper-efficient vascular responses, and superior carbon dioxide buffering. They are a profound testament to the fact that humans are not entirely distinct from the natural world. We are continually being sculpted by it.
It permanently changes how you view the human body. It isn't just a static machine you walk around in. It is a dynamic, evolving history book of every environment your ancestors ever survived.
Absolutely.
Which leaves you with a lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. For our entire modern era, medicine has looked to sterile laboratories to solve the crisis of oxygen deprivation. We build complex ventilators. We synthesize artificial compounds. We try to invent our way out of the trauma of heart attacks and strokes. But what if the key to surviving our most critical medical emergencies isn't going to be invented in a lab at all? What if a blueprint for survival was already written 1,000 years ago, quietly evolving in a culture floating on the Southeast Asian seas? How many other isolated populations out there hold the genetic secrets to human endurance that we simply haven't thought to look for yet?